to leave for a few minutes, the meeting will be recorded and that'll be made available. So this is our January gathering. We met in September to kind of kick things off with all of you for the planning process. And then between then and now, we've met with each of the work groups and with the steering committee to work on developing objectives and goals for the whole collaborative and then objectives for the work groups. So our goals for today's meeting are going to be to review Cornerstones of Collaborative Leadership, which Tanner is going to share with all of us. Then we're going to provide an update on our process and our progress through the strategic planning development. And then we're going to share each of the draft objectives as they currently stand and give everybody an opportunity in the chat to provide final feedback, questions, comments that can get incorporated before the objectives go to the steering committee for final review and approval. And then we'll go over and discuss our next steps, which will be moving forward from taking our final objectives and developing strategies to meet those objectives, which is what we'll be working on for the next couple months. So Tanner, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, right when I said I would not be talking much today, I guess I have the first slide that popped up. But this is quick. Jacqueline or Ashley, whoever has the slides, if you just go ahead and click through all 4 of those. This is something that we started sharing just about a month ago as we're having these meetings. But essentially, as we move forward with this strategic planning partnership, one of the things we want to make sure we're really emphasizing are these cornerstones of collaborative leadership. It was some research that came out of the University of Maryland. But within this partnership, we all have the capacity to lead and to support the work. And what these cornerstones do is just kind of give us a basic framework for what some of those values are that we would want to uphold in terms of compassion, character, courage, and commitment to the work. So I'm not going to read all of these, but we would encourage you all to kind of keep these with you in this conversation, and we'll continue to share them moving forward at our meetings this year. And if you do have any comments on these for today's meeting that you would like to share with the group, please do. We encourage you to write your comments on these in the chat box. It's an evolving conversation, but again, just something that we want to keep in mind as we go forward, that these are the things that we want to uphold in ourselves when we work together in the partnership.
Great, thanks, Tanner. So we're going to do a bit of a where have we been, where are we now, where are we headed update on the process. And so this is a Gantt chart we've been using, so it may look familiar to those of you who've joined us on other meetings for the strategic planning process. We have done our onboarding and process development. We've completed defining, refining, and finalizing our goals. We've completed defining, refining, and finalizing our objectives, and those objectives will be marked as final within the next week and a half. And where we're headed from here is defining, refining, and finalizing action plans for each of the work groups. Those action plans include our objectives and our strategies to meet those objectives, and developing the draft plan, which will pull the input from each of the work groups together and include some overview information on the process that we went through, and make some connections and tie-ins with the operations guide, which is also going to be going through an update in tandem so that the 2 documents work well together for your governance. So for our strategic planning timeline, where we've been in September, or in August really, we met with the steering committee for our first kickoff meeting. Then in September, we had our collaborative gathering with everyone and kicked off the process and did some workshopping around goals, and then built on that in some back and forth emails and surveys for our goals work, and then also to kick off the objectives development, which are work group specific objectives. We met with each of the work groups in November and into early December, developing those work group specific objectives, and then using an online facilitation tool called Jamboard, as well as some follow-up emails and one-on-one conversations. We made revisions and updates to those objectives for each of the work groups. And in December, those were shared with the steering committee, provided additional input, and then also developed their own set of roles. So roles of the steering committee will fill, does fill so that the collaborative can be sustainable. So we'll review the steering committee's roles as well as the work group objectives with everyone today. And after the meeting, we'll make any updates based on chat comments that are coming in, on feedback, questions, concerns. We may follow up one-on-one, or if we can just take a look at the chatted in comments and make updates, we'll do that. We'll share those with the work group or with the steering committee so that they can provide final approval of the objectives so the work groups know what their final objectives are in order to develop our strategies. So for where we're headed, at the end of this month, we will have our objectives all finalized, and starting the first week in February, we're going to start meeting with the work groups again, one-on-one, with each work group to develop the strategies to address those finalized objectives. And then in March, we'll continue those meetings. We'll also be working with the steering committee on developing their responsibilities and having the steering committee review the strategies that have been developed. And then in April, we'll all get together again in another collaborative gathering to do a very similar update to what we're doing now for objectives, but for our strategies. And from there, we'll get the strategies reviewed and approved by the steering committee. And then the final couple months that we'll all be together in May and June, we'll be focusing on bringing it all together in the actual draft and final plan. So now we're going to jump into the objective survey responses. For the survey, we had 6 steering committee members respond, 3 conservation work group, 3 from the education outreach work group, 1 from the stewardship work group, and 8 of our general supporters in the partnership. So we just wanted to give this quick overview to give some context to the feedback that we're going to be walking through and the scores that we have for each of the groups to show what the mix was. We're going to go through each objective. We're going to move pretty quickly through them because we only have an hour here together today. So we'll quickly review each objective, including any feedback or any questions that were received as part of the survey that was just administered earlier this month. So any feedback that was provided there, we have taken a look at, we've reviewed and addressed in a response to comments. If there was overlapping or common feedback, we've included it in here on the slides, and so we'll go through those and address some of those questions if they did or didn't result in updates to the objectives. So please provide any comments or questions about the objectives as we walk through them in the chat box. And just like Tanner put into the chat, share your comments, your ideas, if you have any questions. A lot of the comments that we received as part of the survey were on how to strengthen the objectives and strengthen the roles, and to get really more specific about how we'll accomplish them, which is what we're moving into with our strategy development. So any comments that you have that can help us with those conversations and getting started with the strategies is great. We have some project ideas and specific strategies that we've already started talking about through our Jamboarding process. We have the questions and some input from the survey that we can get started with. So we have a nice foundation for these next meetings when we're going to meet with each of the work groups and the steering committee on developing out those strategies. So if you have any comments on the objectives or on additional things we can consider as we move forward with strategies, feel free to put those in the chat and we will review all of those after the meeting. Here's an overview of that survey feedback. So survey went out earlier this month, and we wanted to share an overview of, with each of the 4 groups, how the weighted averages came out, and to also show it's really reassuring to see that there were so many respondents that thought we were headed in the right direction with the objectives, rating between 9 and 11 for each of the groups, rating the current objectives as they were at the beginning of January as excellent, and having that weighted average between 4.3 and 4.5 out of 5 across each of our groups. So it's really promising to show that we were already on the right track, and we did take some of the feedback to help strengthen some of the objectives that could be strengthened, and you will see some of the updates that we've made since the survey went out. When you're chatting in your comments, questions, we're going to move through each of the objectives pretty quickly. So just to make sure that we know which objective you're talking about, if you can mark it either by saying steering committee role 1 or R1, R2, R3, R4. For conservation work group, it would be C1, C2, C3, C4, and you'll see these on the slides too. So if you have a comment about a specific objective, if you can just try to mark that for us in the chat, that'll help us organize it after the meeting. So we'll start with the steering committee, and the steering committee has 4 roles that were developed in the meetings that we had in December. The first one is this R1, steering the partnership. So the original role that was developed with the steering committee was to provide overall support, vision, and guidance to the collaborative, including helping guide and inform the host partner to best support the collaborative. And some of the suggestions or feedback that we received in the survey were there should be an update periodically to the strategic plan. And that's a great comment, great suggestion, and will probably come up as a responsibility within this role for the steering committee. So one of their responsibilities in providing support to the collaborative and continuing this iterative process of continuous improvement would be to have a plan to review and publish updates to the plan regularly. Another area of feedback that we received was guide and inform partners generally, that we could consider removing the specification of the host. That was something that was discussed with the steering committee, and specifically wanted to clarify that there should be guidance provided to the host partner, especially if the host partner changes and a new host partner is brought on, to make sure that they are fully up to speed on the specific experiences and expertise that the steering committee members have about the collaborative. And then finally, there was some feedback to build in a decision-making mechanism. The operations guide is going to be updated in the near future, and there is some decision-making language in there that'll get updated to make sure that it aligns with the strategic planning process and is strengthened language. Our second role from the steering committee was around financial sustainability or sustainability of the collaborative, and this had come up in a couple of the work group discussions as well. And the original role was financial sustainability convene a subcommittee which develops long-term objectives and strategies to sustain the collaborative, i.e. funding, staffing, and interest. There was a bit of a disconnect between the title of the role, financial sustainability, and what we were actually asking the steering committee to develop, which is this subcommittee, which would address funding, staffing, and interest, which is really broader than just financial sustainability. So we updated it to be sustainability, develop long-term objectives and short-term strategies to sustain the collaborative. And the reason that these changes were made is because the subcommittee, the decision to have a subcommittee, we hadn't figured out yet if the subcommittee was going to be within the steering committee or members of the steering committee and members that were not in the steering committee. And it's such a vitally important piece, especially the financial sustainability, and critical in the short term, that we wanted to take additional time to develop more than just a subcommittee approach to sustaining the collaborative. So this is our second role for the steering committee. It is critical, and it needs to be really strong. And so the role as it stands is sustainability, develop long-term objectives and short-term strategies to sustain the collaborative, and the responsibilities that will be developed will be those objectives and strategies to sustain the collaborative, and there will be a focus on financial sustainability. The third role for our steering committee was policy, and this was another one where there was a lot of discussion and back and forth. about the role of policy and what the steering committee and steering committee members can do, what needs to be done in order to advance local and state policies that support or even just sustain existing policies that support the work that the collaborative does. So we've had updated this one as well. The original role was unclear and needed to be strengthened with some of the partner feedback that was shared. And so it was updated to outreach to decision makers. There was some confusion about the steering committee's ability or role in actually approving things like policy initiatives. And so to remove any confusion around that, it was expanded and clarified. So the new role is to review, approve, and provide support for campaigns that educate to educate decision makers about land conservation, conservation practices, and source water protection. And just thanks everybody for chatting in. Keep the comments coming, and Tanner's responding to comments in the chat, and then we'll also go through and combine them all afterwards and take a look at anything that needs to be addressed now or anything that can be used to inform our agendas for the strategy meetings that we'll be having in the next couple months. Our fourth role for the steering committees, is their fourth and final role, is coordinating with work groups. So the intention of this role is for the steering committee to provide that connecting piece between work groups and then between each of the work groups and the steering committee through the work group liaisons. So we had provide coordination and communication support for internal collaboration between work groups. There was some feedback that might be limiting. They'd like more opportunities to build relationships between partners. And since the intention of this role is for the steering committee to provide that connecting piece, not to be very much oversight, and was updated to be ensure coordination and communication between the work groups and steering committee. So before we move on to the conservation work groups objectives, just want to give everybody another couple minutes or a minute or so to chat in any thoughts, any questions, any things that we should consider, feedback, comments about the four roles that were set up for the steering committee. And while you're doing that, I do want to make it clear that we're really right in the middle of our strategic planning process right now. So we have the roles developed, we have objectives developed, we have updated some of those. They may seem at first glance to have been changed in a way that didn't make them more specific or didn't make them more measurable, but that was in an effort to set us up to be able to develop strategies that are very specific and hit the priorities for those objectives and those roles. So any comments that you have on that are great, and we'll just make sure that we can incorporate those and address them as we move into the strategy development. All right, thanks everyone. So now we're moving into our conservation work group objectives. Conservation work group also has four, like the steering committee with their four roles. The first conservation work group objective is conserving land. So conserve at least 500 acres of prioritized properties annually. And this was the original objectives that was developed for the conservation work group around conservation of land and easements. There was partner feedback, and we've heard this feedback before, asking whether or not this goal is attainable, and asking about focusing only on easements or on the conservation practices as well. So the conservation work group set this objective when we met with them in November. We went back and forth on what the right number was and discussed what the correct metric would be to strive for to meet that challenging yet attainable balance for the metric, and they believed that this is attainable. And in the infographic that was sent out earlier today, there was some information about how many acres of land had been conserved over this past year in 2020, which was over 1,000 acres. So that was a very big year, a great year. But just to kind of put it in perspective, that this metric was something that there was quite a bit of discussion around. And it's a combination of all of the partners' efforts. So it's not that there would be one easement that is 500 acres that would be put in place, but thanks, Tanner just chatted in 2020, 1,100 acres of conserved land within drinking water protection areas was the metric from that infographic. So that it's not that one easement would equate to 500 acres, it's that across the partners within drinking water protection areas, how much acreage has been conserved out of those prioritized properties. For the second comment, focus only on easements or conservation practices. So the conservation work group for this objective in particular is focusing on conservation easements, but when we get to the stewardship work group's objectives, we'll see some more focus on conservation practices. For C2, we have the conservation work group's second objective, collecting and sharing successes. Annually collect and share conserved land statistics from all partners based on the 10 indicators from the GIS prioritization model. Couple of great questions here. Who will the statistics be shared with? How will we ensure all the partners participate? These are details that we'll be fleshing out during the strategy development process. So questions like this are really great to have in mind and to come to our strategy development meetings for those of you that are participating in the work groups, to come to the meetings with those types of questions because they'll help us hone in on the strategies that will ultimately allow us to meet these objectives. This is our third objective for the conservation work group, which is focused on landowner engagement. So it's to provide opportunities for conservation easement landowners to learn about and contribute to the partners initiative at least once per year. The original title was landowner outreach. The only change that was made here was replacing outreach with engagement. And the original version was slightly unclear, but engagement is a more precise term, was the partner comment that we received in the survey that led to that change. So it's a more, it gets more specific to the work that would actually be done under this role, engaging those landowners instead of conducting outreach to them. Our fourth and final objective for the conservation work group is C4 here, engaging utilities. And this is the same objective that was in the survey. Annually work with water utilities to exchange ideas and explore opportunities to coordinate land conservation efforts, including identifying and accessing funding. So the only comment, feedback we really got from partners on this from the survey to potentially address is whether this would be working with member utilities or member utilities and non-term and non-member utilities. So most utilities that are in the area where you all are working are members to some extent, and there's no reason to limit outreach to members, but as you would with any other outreach campaigns or engagement that you're doing, it would be beneficial to start with member utilities because you already have relationships with them. They understand the work that the collaborative is doing. They may be involved in some of the work the collaborative is doing and aligning their efforts with the collaborative. So starting with them and then maybe expanding to non-member utilities or utilities if you're expanding, if the collaborative expands into additional areas. Expanding your engagement to those utilities would be a great way to continue the work and expanding the work you're doing. So again, if you have any comments, any questions, feedback, things that we should be considering as we move forward with strategies for each of these objectives, please type those into the chat. So we have our 4 objectives for the conservation work group. C1, conserving land, which is conserving at least 500 acres of prioritized properties annually. C2, collecting and sharing successes, the annual collection and sharing of conservation data. C3, landowner engagement, and then C4, engaging utilities. Moving on to our next work group, we have the Education and Outreach Work Group. Education Outreach Work Group also has 4 objectives that were developed. The first is successful landowner outreach, in parentheses, conservation. So this is at least one conservation easement initiated on priority lands annually as a result of our outreach efforts. And there was some confusion, and this question has come up before. Do we need to specify outreach to landowners of priority lands within education outreach objectives? And is this consistent with the conservation work group's objectives? So the conservation work group's objective that I think is being referred to here is that 500 acres of land conserved. And the difference is they aren't a one-to-one relationship. We're not saying that the conservation easement that is initiated because of the education and outreach work groups outreach efforts, equates to 500 acres. We're saying that across all efforts in the collaborative and with the collaborative's partners, that the total acreage that would be conserved is going to, the aim is going to be 500 acres. For the education outreach work group specifically, they want to be able to directly tie at least one easement on priority lands to their outreach efforts and campaigns. And then for specifying outreach, we'll get more specific about audiences and tools and mechanisms for engaging landowners and for this landowner outreach when we work on the strategies. But reaching out to landowners on priority lands will be critical to achieving this objective. Our second education outreach objective is successful landowner outreach stewardship. So E1 more directly ties to the conservation work group, and E2 more directly ties to the stewardship work group and their efforts. The objective here is at least 3 landowners will implement conservation practices on priority lands annually as a result of our outreach efforts. So there have only been 2 minor changes to this from what was sent out in the survey. The first was to address a partner suggestion to add will after landowners. At least 3 landowners will implement. And then the second is the replacement of stewardship practices with conservation practices based on our meetings with the stewardship work group. Conservation practices is the term that is more widely used. It's a more accurate term for the work that the stewardship work group is going to be trying to prioritize and push forward. So there have been a few updates made to incorporate that change so that we're all using the same terminology into some of the other objectives. Our third objective for Education and Outreach Work Group E3 is public outreach. So this is to reach 1,000 members of the public about the connection between land conservation, conservation practices, and source water protection through at least 2 annual outreach campaigns. And the first note we have here on the feedback from partners is that Stewardship Work Group is using the term conservation practices. So that update was made in the public outreach objective here for education outreach. And then the second was a question whether members of the public include target audiences. And this will again be fleshed out in the strategies, but the education outreach work group will work on reaching out to those target audiences as well as the general public. So this public outreach is more of a general public effort for the objective versus specifically to landowners, which would be a more targeted and prioritized area. So this objective is more focused on raising that general awareness among the public. Which separates it from our E1 and E2, which is that landowner outreach for conservation and stewardship. Our fourth objective for the Education and Outreach Work Group was internal communications, improved communications through annual evaluation of internal communication tools and mechanisms. And there was a note about how other objectives are more specific about the tools that they'll use or the metrics that they'll be tracking against. And the tools could be regular periodic news, document sharing website, seeking input from members on needs. And these are all great ideas for strategies that could be developed under the communications objective here for education and outreach. So this question came from others and others from the survey responses. Those are all going to come together to inform our strategies development. For those of you who were on the work group meetings when we developed objectives, you may remember that we used Jamboards for that, which is an online facilitation tool. What we did there is sort of reverse engineered a lot of our objectives by saying what kind of work do we want to do, what sort of projects do we want to engage in, and then figuring out how those grouped together into cohesive objectives for the work groups. So we have some of those projects and ideas and input, plus we have these questions from the survey that we're going to pull together, and that'll give us a really strong starting point for our strategy development. Something that came up not through the survey, which is why it's here in orange instead of in green, is that the other objectives seem to have more of an evaluation component. And so here we would just be suggesting a change to the title of this objective from internal communications to evaluate communications. The other change is to expand. We had been focused on internal communications, but there was also a discussion when we met with the steering committee about external communication tools and mechanisms and how to make sure that not only are you effectively communicating internally within the collaborative, but that you're also effectively communicating externally through things like external newsletters and other mechanisms, blog posts and news articles, things like that. So we'd also proposed expanding it. So we would be changing from internal communications to evaluate communications and improve communications through annual evaluation of internal and external communication tools and mechanisms. And then when we get to our strategies, we could have two strategies, one to address internal communication evaluation and one to address external communication evaluation. So if you have any comments, particularly on this one, because it is a bit of a deviation and it didn't come directly from the survey responses, we would really appreciate just a thumbs up or any concerns that you have about adding external and updating the title of this education and outreach objective. So this is for E4. Moving into our final work group, so we have the stewardship work group. We'll also go through 4 objectives for the stewardship work group like we have for the others and the steering committee. Here we have S1, landowner outreach, support water utility partners in conducting conservation practice outreach to 500 potential cooperators annually in alignment with their source water protection plans. So there were questions about whether this is an attainable goal and if it could be more specific. The stewardship work group thought that this was attainable, but these are some really good questions, and we'll be picking these up and moving forward with them as we move into our strategies development to get more specific. For our second, we have the Stewardship Workgroup S2 objective, new cooperators, support at least 10 new cooperators in implementing conservation practices in drinking water protection areas annually. So we had some feedback here. Should this objective begin with an action verb and how are cooperators defined? So we did update to, we thought the addition of an action verb was very strong and helped to align and update the objective to be more like our other objectives and to be a little more specific. The word that we chose was support. We tried a few different words, a few different verbs out in here in this spot, and support seemed to be the right were to then lead to one or more strategies of what support will mean. So at least to support at least 10 new cooperators in implementing conservation practices and drinking water protection areas annually. How are cooperators defined? A cooperator is a landowner who's implementing conservation practices on their land. This is a term that the partners in the stewardship work group use. And so or it's another sort of terminology alignment thing where the West Virginia Conservation Agency uses this term for their folks. And since they're very well represented in the stewardship work group and in the work that the stewardship work group does, that seemed like the right term to carry into the collaborative. Our third objective for the stewardship work group, S3, is riparian forest buffers. Support the establishment of 5 acres of riparian forest buffers in drinking water protection areas annually. This remains unchanged from when it was first sent out with the survey. Some questions that came up in response to this were, is this goal challenging enough? And what does support mean in this context? So based on discussions, again, anytime that a metric is used like 5 acres or 500, in reaching 500 individuals, 500 acres, those were all very, they were all developed with that attainable, challenging balance in mind with the work groups and trying to figure out where that balancing point is and proposing metrics and then responding, reacting to those. So the work group does believe that that is the attainable yet challenging goal for an annual establishment of riparian forest buffer areas. And then what does support mean in this context? This is something that I think is broader. It's not just a relevant comment or question for this objective, but for many of our objectives where we're talking about where we use engage, conduct outreach, support, where we get into the specifics about what those mean, that's going to be in our strategies. What are the mechanisms? What are the tools? Who are the audiences? How are we going to meet them? And then how are we going to confirm or measure that we've met what our priority objectives were? The final objective for the stewardship work group is a proposed objective. So what we identified as we were going through and reviewing the objectives for each of the work groups and the steering committee, identified that there was a gap with the stewardship work group and between the stewardship work group and the conservation work group and how they would be collecting and sharing information so that the education and outreach work group could support their efforts and vice versa. So this is new, and we're going to kind of toggle between this slide and the next one as we discuss it. This is another area, just like the education and outreach objective, where we made some significant changes to where we would really love to hear your feedback and get any questions out of the way, any discussion. So please do type in the chat for that. The way that we came to the need for this is taking a look at the conservation work group where we had objectives C1, C3, and C4, which are all going to generate metrics. They're going to give us accomplishments of some sort if we measure against them. And then C2 is collecting and sharing successes. So that's a specific objective for the conservation work group. For the stewardship work group, we didn't have an objective that was specific to collecting and sharing successes. And so in order to amplify and make sure that the work that's done to meet objectives S1, S2, and S3, we would add in this fourth objective for the stewardship work group so that the stewardship work group and the conservation work group can both coordinate with the education and outreach work group on successful landowner outreach and on other outreach campaigns that the educational work and outreach work group will be undertaking to meet their goals. and vice versa, so that it opens those lines of communications. What we want to make clear on here, and which is why we've included the annual accomplishments over on the right-hand side of the slide, is that when we talk about collecting and sharing successes, we're not talking about collecting and sharing names, personal and other personal identifying information. We're talking about the types of metrics like what was sent out earlier today in that infographic and that Tanner linked to in the chat earlier in this meeting. So it's making sure that we can coordinate on our successes and measuring, collecting, measuring, and then distributing, sharing those successes, and that there's a nice balance by having a specific objective to collect and share those successes in the stewardship work group, like we do have in the conservation work group. So I'm just going to go back up to S4 and let folks take another look at it. Please provide any comments in the chat if you do have any about strengthening this, changing it, if you don't think it's necessary, or if there are any changes that should be made. This is to help inform the education and outreach work group achievements and vice versa, to have that nice balance and built-in coordination, since that is also an objective of the steering committee, is to make sure that there is coordination and work going on across. So we took a lot of language, similar language as the conservation work group, but because the stewardship work group doesn't have the same metrics with the GIS prioritization model, it's not exactly the same. So those are all of the workgroup objectives. Our final item on the agenda is to go over next steps and questions. So in the, since we do have a little more time left, since we didn't have as much discussion or a discussion focused call, we're open, welcoming any other comments, questions, feedback that folks have. I know there's been a lot of activity in the chat and trying to sort of keep an eye on it while we've been presenting, but if there's anything specific that we should discuss, I don't know, Tanner, if there's anything that you've seen in the chat that you want to summarize or bring up for folks before we move to next steps.
I don't. I think if anything, if we have those extra maybe 5 to 10 minutes or so, I would rather put it out to folks with what they've seen and what they've heard so far. If there's one that they want to go back and talk about more in detail, that would maybe be the best way to do it. Maybe those, starting with those two that had the orange text.
Sure, yeah. So our education outreach work group E4, evaluate communications. Let's see, I don't know that I saw much other than some confirmation that the change was good in the chat. So if anyone has any other comments they want to share about this one, feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in.
We can also take the long pregnant pause there. If folks are pretty generally okay with it, then that's also one way we can interpret that. There's also the reactions button on the bottom hand of your Zoom screen that you can kind of give a thumbs up without having to unmute and speak up on that one. All right, that's good. How about the other one, Ashley?
Well, just a quick question. So Ashley, this is Daryl. And I may have missed this. So is this in addition to internal communications? It doesn't replace internal communication, does it?
It does. It does replace, but it replaces it, but I really don't think it, I wouldn't think of it that way, because we're basically took internal communications and just added external communications onto it. So instead of this objective only being focused on evaluating internal communications, we've also included external communications so that when we get to the strategies, we would end up with a strategy for internal and a strategy for external.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Daryl?
Yeah, I guess maybe the way you presented it looks different to me, because
Sure.
usually it was done as some sort of a red line, and here it looks almost like it's, again, in addition to, or.
Yeah, yeah. Apologies for any confusion there. We didn't want to treat this one the same way, since it was a little more of proposing a change versus saying this is the change that was made. But thanks for those questions. Okay, great. So that sounds like we're in a good place on this, on E4. Any other questions or comments, feel free to unmute or type in the chat. And then the other significant update was our new stewardship workgroup objective, which I've seen some chatting in. They thinking it's a good addition. Would be nice to be able to measure annually, year over year, for the stewardship work group's progress, as well as the what was already set up for the conservation work group. So any questions, any additional feedback or concerns with adding this, particularly if there are any stewardship work group members on, since this didn't come from the work group and from our discussions?
I think it's a good idea. Tanner and I had talked earlier just about logistics of exactly what that's going to look like, and making sure the different agencies can report that information. So that's something we'll have to work out. But like a lot of people mentioned in the chat box, just being able to track from year to year what we're doing, I think would be, a really good goal for us to have.
Great, thanks, Kristen.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I think, like Ashley mentioned, like was that in the chat, just like if you go to the next slide you showed a second ago, Ashley, with image, just like the image on the right that we shared this morning. The goal here is not to share personal information or to share cooperator lists, but just to try to compile within these two counties where we're working, and specifically within drinking water protection areas, what practices are going in the ground, and putting that together so that we can track our own successes as a work group, like meeting that 5 acres of buffers within drinking water protection areas. To just meet that objective, we have to be collecting that information. And then also, again, to kind of connect to our education outreach efforts, we want to make sure that our outreach is having an impact, that practices are getting in the ground, and we can only get there by collecting and sharing those successes. So Kristen, if you could do me a favor as we carry this on, try to chat with Amy and Barbie and Tim. You guys might not be in the office right now, but if there's a way to talk to those folks in this week and kind of get their general feedback as well, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, and any ideas that if you're having those conversations that start to generate based on those conversations, any ideas that you start generating for our strategies and getting to those specifics that you and Tanner had discussed, just bring those to our strategies meeting. And that goes for everyone across the work groups. When we come back together for our strategies meetings, if there was anything that stood out to you, or any ideas that were sparked for how we're going to take these objectives and get to the specific tools, mechanisms, audiences, those areas that we need to pull together in order to have strategies that are action plans that are actionable. That's would be great if you have any thoughts, to bring those to our meetings. And just seeing in the chat, maybe change the structure of the objective to begin with a verb to remain consistent with the other objectives and include a minimum of once per year. Those are great suggestions, Kristen. Thanks. Okay, are there any other objectives or the roles from the steering committee that we went through that folks would like to revisit? We have about 2 minutes before we need to move on to our next steps. Seeing head shaking. Okay, then we'll move on. Like I said, and Tanner said, we're going to go through all of the chats that did come in. We'll process all of that information. We'll take a look at what we had presented, what the chatted in responses are, make any additional updates that need to be made based on the conversations in the chat, and then that list is going to be what goes to the steering committee. So that's our next step, is for Cadmus, Jacqueline, and I to go through all of those chats, to consider the conversations that we had here today, especially about the E4 and S4 objectives, and to make any necessary updates to those objectives. We will send those out. Tanner will send those out to the steering committee next week to get final approval on the work group objectives so that we can start meeting with each of the work groups and developing the strategies. So our work groups will start meeting to develop strategies in February, and those meetings will continue into March. So it'll be very similar to our sort of November, December timeline for the objective setting. We'll meet in February and March to develop our strategies. There will be some back and forth using Jamboards, email. We may have to have some surveys. There are a lot of details to hash out in the strategy development. So we'll use similar tools and a similar process as we did for objectives, so that we're not putting too many meetings on your calendars, but still making sure we're getting confirmation on all of those details, that they're really being driven by you all and the work that you want to do and the work that's going to allow you to meet these objectives. So we'll meet with the Stewardship Workgroup in early February, on February 4th, that's been scheduled. And then Tanner's going to send out doodle polls after this meeting for Education Outreach Work Group, the Conservation Work Group, and the Steering Committee to schedule your calls. So those will get scheduled in the next couple, those will be put on the calendar in the next couple weeks for mid-February to mid-March. And we'll take all of that input and all of that information from our meetings, pull those together to come together again in April, when we'll have another gathering. Similar to this one, we'll be sharing what the current drafted strategies are to meeting our objectives. And the steering committee will review and approve those in April, and they'll all get pulled together into our draft plan, which will be available for everyone to review in May, and then we'll be finalizing it in June to close out the strategic planning effort, development effort. So if there are any questions about next steps, feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in. Otherwise, that is all that we had to share and present. Thank you all so much for participating and jumping on the call, providing your being actively engaged in the chat, and especially to steering committee work group members who have been putting in a lot of time and effort to finesse and refine these objectives to make sure that they're going to give you a nice framework and foundation for moving forward.
And thank you all for your time. This is a lot of information to get through in an hour. As always, the recording of this will be posted on the website and sent out tomorrow. Keep an eye out for the doodle polls, and this presentation and all the meeting documents will be up on the website as well.
Tanner, this is Frank Rogers. I just want to say thanks for inviting me. I know I'm late to this, but I'm very impressed. And so thank you very much. And it's great to see similar or familiar faces. Happy New Year, everyone.
Thanks, Frank. Have a good day, everyone. Enjoy getting out of the meeting early.
See you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.